Chapter 1. The Echo of Unchosen Hearts. The scent of crushed mint and dried lavender clung to Zara's skin like a second layer of armor. It was a healer's perfume, a fragrance that spoke of quiet rooms and the steady rhythm of stitching flesh back together. While the rest of the Silver Moon Pack thrived under the adrenaline of the hunt, Zara lived in the silences between heartbeats. She moved through the infirmary with a ghostly grace, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of a warrior's scarred shoulder. Every touch was an unspoken prayer for a stability she couldn't quite grasp for herself. Because she spent her days mending others, she had become an expert at ignoring the frayed edges of her own soul. Outside the stone walls of her sanctuary, the atmosphere hummed with a different kind of energy. It was the season of the Great Pairing, a time when the lunar pull became a physical weight in the air. Zara watched from the narrow window as young females draped themselves in silk, their laughter drifting upward like colorful ribbons. They were waiting to be claimed, hoping for that electric jolt of recognition that signaled a fated match. Zara felt a familiar hollow ache settle behind her ribs. It wasn't that she lacked beauty. Her hair was the color of midnight rain, and her eyes held the depth of an ancient forest. It was simply that she felt invisible in a world that rewarded the loud and the fierce. "You're doing it again," a soft voice chided from the doorway. Zara turned to see Alara, her only true friend, leaning against the wooden frame. Alara was vibrant, a wildfire in human form, already bonded to a loyal beta who followed her like a shadow. Zara offered a small, tired smile and returned to grinding herbs in her mortar. The rhythmic thud of the pestle served as a heartbeat for the room. She needed to focus on the tangible, the physical reality of roots and resins, rather than the misty dreams of a mate who might never materialize. Why would a warrior seek out a woman who smelled of medicine instead of moonlight? The town square began to fill with the heavy, musky scent of dominant males. This was the hierarchy in its rawest form, a display of strength and genetic promise. Zara's hands trembled slightly as she poured a shimmering blue tincture into a glass vial. She told herself she didn't care about the ceremony, that her work was more important than a public claim. However, the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Every woman deserved to be seen, to be the singular focus of a gaze that promised protection and devotion. For Zara, the fear of being unchosen was a constant companion, a shadow that grew longer with every passing year. Suddenly, the collective breath of the pack seemed to hitch. A ripple of agitation moved through the crowd outside, a wave of submission that signaled the arrival of someone truly formidable. Zara's wolf, usually a quiet presence in the back of her mind, paced restlessly. The air grew thick, charged with an ozone-like tension that made the hair on Zara's arms stand up. She didn't need to look outside to know that the dynamic had shifted. Someone dangerous had entered their territory, someone whose power was so absolute, it commanded silence without a single word. "Did you hear the whispers?" Alara asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "They say the High Alpha is looking for more than just a political alliance this time. He's searching for a reason to stay." Zara kept her eyes on her work, though her pulse was now a frantic drum against her throat. She didn't want to be a reason, she wanted to be a choice. The idea of being a mere puzzle piece in an alpha's legacy felt cold and clinical. Because she understood the fragility of life, she craved a love that was robust and undeniable. She watched a pair of lovers walk past the infirmary, their fingers entwined so tightly it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. That was the stability she hungered for, a bond that wouldn't snap under the weight of a storm. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder echoed through the clear sky, a herald of the approaching lunar peak. The healers in the back room hurried to secure the shutters, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Zara remained still, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. She felt a strange pull, a tugging at her navel that had nothing to do with the moon. It was a call from the deep, a vibration that resonated in her very marrow. She set the mortar aside, her heart leaping into a gallop. Was it possible that the silence of her life was about to be shattered? The bells of the great hall began to toll, heavy and somber. It was the summons for all unbonded members to gather for the evening's blessing. Zara wiped her hands on her apron, the green stains of the herbs lingering like a mark of her trade. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, not toward the hall, but toward the dark safety of the tree line. The forest had always been her true confessional, the only place where she didn't have to hide her longing. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the whispers started, swirling around her like dead leaves. "The alpha has found his mate," a voice hissed from the shadows. The words struck Zara like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stopped dead in her tracks, her vision blurring for a brief second. A mixture of envy and relief washed over her, a chaotic storm of emotions she couldn't name. If the alpha had found his match, the pressure on the rest of them would lessen, but the void in her own life would only seem wider. She wondered who the lucky woman was, which fierce warrior had captured the heart of a king. She didn't realize she was moving toward the forest until the damp moss was already beneath her boots. The canopy above swallowed the remaining light, plunging the world into a realm of silver and charcoal. Zara breathed in the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, letting it ground her. She needed to be alone with her failure, to reconcile the woman she was with the woman the pack expected her to be. Behind her, the village glowed with 1,000 lanterns, a mockery of the darkness she felt inside. She pushed deeper into the brush, ignoring the thorns that snagged her skirt. There was a secret clearing a mile in, a place where the stars felt close enough to touch. As she broke through the final thicket, the world went silent. The crickets stopped their chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Zara froze, her senses screaming a warning she didn't yet understand. The air here was different. It was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the terrifying scent of an apex predator. She shouldn't have come so far alone, not during a full moon. She turned to retreat, but a low guttural sound stopped her cold. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound of a god breathing in the dark. Is safety found in the arms of a lover or in the absence of one? Chapter 2. The Predator's Mercy. Kael moved through the undergrowth like a shadow made of muscle and malice. Every step was a calculated risk, his body screaming in protest as the silver-laced wound in his side wept crimson. He was the alpha of the Obsidian Peak, a man whose name was synonymous with conquest and iron-fisted rule. Yet, here he was, bleeding out in the territory of a lesser pack, hunted by shadows he couldn't see. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life avoiding the vulnerability of a mate, believing that a heart was just a target for an enemy's blade. Now, his own mortality was staring him in the face with cold, unblinking eyes. The forest seemed to shift around him, the trees leaning in as if to witness his fall. Kael stumbled, his hand catching a jagged piece of slate that sliced into his palm. He didn't flinch. Pain was an old friend, a constant companion that kept him tethered to the physical world. He could hear his pursuers in the distance, the frantic baying of hounds and the rhythmic beat of horses. They thought they had trapped a wolf, but they had merely cornered a demon. Because he refused to die in the dirt, he forced his legs to keep moving, his vision tunneling into a narrow slit of determination. He broke into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating the carnage of his own making. His clothes were shredded, his skin a roadmap of fresh lacerations and old regrets. He collapsed against a moss-covered rock, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. This was the end of the line, the place where the legend of Kael would turn into a cautionary tale. He closed his eyes, expecting the darkness to take him. Instead, he felt a sudden electric jolt sizzle through his veins. It wasn't the searing heat of a silver burn. It was something ancient, something primal. His eyes snapped open as a figure emerged from the opposite side of the clearing. It was a woman, her presence so sudden she seemed to have been woven from the moonlight itself. She didn't look like a warrior. She was small, delicate, smelling of crushed herbs and a strange, intoxicating sweetness that made his head spin. Kael's wolf, usually a roaring beast of destruction, suddenly went still. It wasn't a submissive silence, it was a recognition. The bond, the one thing he had spent a decade running from, slammed into him with the force of a mountain slide. Zara stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and an empathy that Kael found offensive. She saw his blood, his weakness, and his monstrous nature all at once. Kael tried to stand, to reclaim some shred of his dignity, but his knees buckled. He lashed out, his hand shooting forward to catch her by the throat. It was a reflex, a desperate attempt to maintain control in a world that was spinning out of his grasp. Her skin was incredibly soft against his rough, calloused palm, a contrast that burned worse than the silver. "You saw nothing," Kael rasped, his voice a broken shard of glass. He expected her to scream, to claw at his hand, or to shift and fight back. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, her gaze locked onto his with a haunting intensity. She didn't look at him like a monster. She looked at him like a patient. Her hand rose slowly, not to strike him, but to hover near the wound in his side. The heat radiating from her palm was unbearable, a soothing balm that his body desperately wanted to reject. He tightened his grip on her throat, watching the pulse jump beneath her skin. "I can save you," she whispered, her voice a feather-light touch against his jagged nerves. Kael felt a surge of fury. He didn't want to be saved by a girl with flower-stained hands. He wanted to be feared. Yet, as the bond pulsed between them, a golden thread of light connecting their souls, he realized he was powerless against her. The predator had been snared by the prey. He leaned his forehead against hers, the proximity forcing him to breathe in her scent until it filled his lungs. It was a violation of everything he believed in. He was a king, and she was a healer from a dying pack. The universe had a sick sense of humor. "If you touch me, I will destroy you," he threatened, though the words lacked their usual bite. Zara didn't flinch at the venom in his tone. She moved closer instead, her body pressing against his in a way that should have been a provocation but felt like a homecoming. She reached for the satchel at her hip, pulling out a needle and a length of silk thread. Kael watched her with a wary fascination. He could kill her in a heartbeat, snap her neck before she could draw another breath. But the wolf inside him was leaning into her touch, whimpering for a connection he had spent a lifetime denying. The air in the clearing grew heavy with the scent of pine and ozone as she began to work. She didn't use magic. She used skill, her fingers moving with a precision that spoke of 1,000 hours spent over broken bodies. Kael felt the needle pierce his skin, a sharp sting followed by the miraculous dulling of his pain. She was stitching his life back together, one steady pull at a time. Every movement was a testament to her strength, a quiet resilience that rivaled his own brute force. He realized then that he had underestimated the power of a healer. As she finished the final knot, the sounds of his pursuers grew louder. They were close now, their torches flickering through the trees like angry fireflies. Kael looked at the woman who had just saved his life, the woman who was now linked to him by a destiny he didn't want. He should take her with him, claim her before anyone else could. But he saw the fear in the depths of her forest-green eyes, the way she looked at his blood-stained hands. He was a storm, and she was a sapling. If he stayed, he would snap her in half. He released her throat, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on her jaw. He leaned in close, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The heat of his breath made her shiver, a reaction that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire through his gut. He hated how much he wanted her. He hated that she was the only thing in this world that felt real. He shoved her away with a sudden, violent motion, his eyes flashing a dangerous, molten gold. "Run, little healer," he commanded, his voice dropping to a predatory growl. "Run before I decide that I don't care if I break you." She didn't wait for a second warning. She turned and vanished into the brush, a flash of white fabric against the dark wood. Kael stood alone in the clearing, the weight of the bond pulling at his chest like a physical chain. He looked down at the neat silver-white stitches in his side, a permanent mark of her touch. He had entered this forest a dying man, and he was leaving it as something far worse, a man with something to lose. The hunt was no longer about survival. It was about the woman who had seen the monster and decided to stitch him back together. Can a king ever truly belong to a woman who knows his scars better than his crown? Chapter 3: The Weight of the Crown. The morning light felt like an intrusion, a harsh glare that exposed the secrets Zara had tried to bury in the forest. She sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers tracing the faint red marks on her neck where Kael's hand had rested. The memory of his touch was a burn that wouldn't heal, a phantom sensation that made her skin hum with a restless energy. She had spent her entire life wanting to be chosen, but she never imagined the choice would look like a blood-stained alpha with eyes like dying stars. Because she was a healer, she knew that some wounds were too deep for medicine, and the bond she felt was a gaping chasm she didn't know how to cross. The infirmary was unusually quiet, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and antiseptic. Zara tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the clearing. She could still smell him: smoke, leather, and a dark, underlying musk that made her wolf pace in circles. She had saved a monster, a man who had threatened to destroy her even as she mended his flesh. That was the paradox of the Alpha. He was a force of nature, a landslide disguised as a man, and according to the ancient laws of their kind, he was hers. A sudden commotion in the courtyard drew her to the window. A carriage, black as a raven's wing and adorned with silver filigree, had pulled up to the great hall. It was flanked by warriors who looked as though they had been carved from granite, their expressions cold and unyielding. This was the Obsidian Peak delegation, the emissaries of the man who had nearly killed her the night before. Zara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. If they were here, it meant the secret she had kept in the woods was about to be dragged into the light of day. "Zara, you need to come now!" Alara burst into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. Zara followed her friend out into the sunlight, her legs feeling like lead. The entire pack had gathered in the square, a sea of anxious faces and hushed whispers. At the center of it all stood the Alpha of Silver Moon, looking small and fragile next to the obsidian-clad giants. One of the visitors stepped forward, a scroll of heavy vellum in his hand. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight toward the infirmary as if he could scent the mint and lavender on Zara's skin from across the distance. "By the decree of the High Alpha Kael of the Obsidian Peak," the man announced, his voice booming like a physical weight. "The search for the fated mate has ended. The blood has called to blood, and the moon has made its choice." The crowd erupted into a chaotic blend of gasps and murmurs. Zara felt the eyes of her pack turn toward her, 1,000 judgments landing on her shoulders at once. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the stone of the buildings. Instead, she stood her ground, her chin tilted up in a gesture of defiance she didn't truly feel. She saw the shock on the faces of the women who had mocked her, the sudden sharp realization that the invisible healer was now the most important person in the territory. It wasn't the victory she had imagined. It felt like a sentence. Kael emerged from the carriage, his presence instantly silencing the crowd. He was dressed in formal leathers, his side showing no sign of the agony he had been in mere hours ago. He looked regal, terrifying, and utterly distant. He didn't smile at her. He didn't offer a look of recognition. He simply walked toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a hunter approaching trapped prey. Every eye followed him, the air crackling with the intensity of his aura. When he stopped in front of Zara, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The healer," he said, the word sounding like a challenge. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her face upward so she was forced to meet his gaze. His eyes were a swirling vortex of gold and shadow, revealing nothing of the man who had leaned his forehead against hers in the dark. He was playing a part, the cold and untouchable sovereign, while she was left to navigate the wreckage of her own emotions. Because he wouldn't acknowledge their shared moment, she felt a sharp, stinging rejection. He was claiming her body and her title, but he was locking his heart behind a wall of ice. "I am Zara," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. The Alpha's grip tightened slightly, a reminder of the power he held over her life. He turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing out with a cold finality. "She is the one. Prepare the ceremony. By tomorrow's moon, the silver moon and the Obsidian Peak shall be one." The declaration felt like a slammed door. There was no courtship, no whispered promises, no choice. Zara was being absorbed into his empire like a conquered village. As the warriors began to organize the logistics of the move, she was ushered toward the great hall, her life in the infirmary left behind like a discarded cloak. She saw Alara watching her from the sidelines, her friend's face a mask of pity. Zara realized then that the stability she had craved was a myth. She wasn't being chosen for who she was being claimed for what she represented. Inside the hall, the air was stifling, filled with the scent of lilies and old dust. Zara was surrounded by seamstresses and attendants, their hands fluttering over her like nervous birds. They draped her in heavy silks the color of a bruised sky, the fabric weighing her down. She caught a glimpse of herself in a silver mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The healer was gone, replaced by a puppet queen. She looked for Kael in the shadows of the room, but he was gone, already deep in discussions with the elders. Night fell, bringing with it a restless, uneasy silence. Zara sat by the window of her new quarters, watching the moon climb toward its zenith. She felt the bond pulsing in her blood, a rhythmic thud that matched the heartbeat of the man in the next room. She wanted to go to him, to demand to know why he was being so cold, why he had saved her life only to bury her in a tomb of expectations. But the fear held her back. The fear that if she reached out, she would find nothing but air. The ceremony was less than 12 hours away, a ritual that would bind their souls together forever. Zara looked at her hands, the fingers that had stitched his skin, and wondered if she was strong enough to survive the love of a man who viewed vulnerability as a weakness. He had said that tomorrow everything would change, but as she watched the clouds drift across the moon, she realized the change had already happened. She was no longer unchosen, but she had never felt more alone. Does the crown provide protection, or is it just a heavier set of chains? Chapter 4. The Altar of Ash. The morning of the mating ceremony did not arrive with a golden sunrise, but with a bruised, oppressive gray that seemed to leach the color from the world. Zara stood before the floor-to-length mirror in the High Alpha's guest chambers, her breath hitching against the constricting ribs of a gown made of liquid silver and bone-white lace. It was a masterpiece of intimidation, designed to transform a village healer into a trophy fit for the Obsidian Peak. Yet, as the handmaids pinned a veil of gossamer silk to her dark hair, Zara felt less like a bride and more like a sacrificial lamb being gilded for the blade. Because her heart was a creature of soft pulses and steady rhythms, the jagged, predatory energy vibrating through the stone walls made her stomach churn with a nausea she couldn't suppress. Outside, the drums began to beat, a rhythmic, primitive thud that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. It was the sound of a pack claiming its future, but to Zara, it sounded like a countdown. She paced the room, the heavy train of her dress hissing against the cold floor like a disgruntled serpent. Why hadn't Kael come to her? Since the moment he had publicly claimed her in the square, he had been a ghost, a silhouette moving behind heavy oak doors, surrounded by advisors and war chiefs. The intimacy of the forest clearing, the heat of his forehead against hers, and the way he had allowed her to stitch his very soul back together felt like a fever dream she had invented to cope with her own loneliness. "It is time, Luna," a voice croaked from the doorway. Zara turned to see an elder of the Obsidian Peak, a woman whose face was a map of ancient scars and ritual tattoos. There was no warmth in the woman's eyes, only a clinical appraisal of Zara's worth as a vessel for Kael's legacy. Zara nodded, her throat too tight for speech, and followed the elder down the winding stone staircase toward the great altar. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the scent of burning cedar and the musky, overwhelming pheromones of hundreds of unmated wolves. This was the moment she had dreamed of since she was a girl, the moment she would be chosen, but the reality was a suffocating weight that made her want to scream. They emerged into the open air of the ancestral grounds, a natural amphitheater carved into the side of the mountain. Thousands of eyes tracked her progress, a silent jury of warriors and matrons who saw her as an outsider, a weak link in their ironclad chain. At the summit of the altar stood Kael. He looked magnificent and monstrous, draped in the black furs of a dire wolf, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity under the overcast sky. As Zara climbed the final steps, her wolf let out a tentative, hopeful whimper, reaching for the bond that thrummed between them like a live wire. She looked at Kael, searching for a spark of the man she had saved, but his face was a mask of granite, devoid of even a flicker of affection. The high priest stepped forward, his voice a guttural chant that invoked the Moon Mother and the spirits of the bloodline. He took Zara's hand and Kael's, pressing their palms together over a ceremonial blade. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated power that made Zara's knees tremble. She looked up at Kael, her heart in her eyes, offering him everything she was, her healing, her loyalty, her very life. She waited for the words that would seal them, for the vow that would turn her fear into a fortress. Kael of Obsidian, the priest intoned, the blade gleaming. Do you accept this woman as your fated, your mate, and your equal in blood? The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen from the air. Kael's hand, which had been warm against hers, suddenly turned ice cold. He didn't look at the priest. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at Zara, and for the first time she saw the sheer, unbridled terror lurking behind his golden irises. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of the part of himself that loved her. Because he believed that vulnerability was a death sentence, he chose to commit a murder of the soul rather than risk a wound to his heart. No, Kael said, his voice a low, brutal rasp that echoed off the mountain walls. The word was a physical blow. Zara felt her heart fracture, a jagged tear opening in the center of her being that no medicine could ever mend. The crowd let out a collective, horrified gasp, a sound like 1,000 intake of breaths. Kael dropped her hand as if it were a burning coal, his expression shifting into one of cold, calculated disdain. He stepped back, severing the physical connection, and in that moment, the bond didn't just break, it exploded. A scream ripped from Zara's throat, a sound of such profound agony that several people in the front row flinched. Her wolf, the spirit that had guided her through the darkest nights of her life, let out one final, agonizing howl of betrayal. Then it went silent. The internal connection, the constant hum of instinct and companionship vanished, leaving Zara a hollow shell of a woman. She collapsed to her knees on the cold stone, her silver dress pooling around her like spilled moonlight. She looked up at Kael, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall, searching for a reason, a sign, a glimmer of regret. But Kael had already turned his back on her, his cape billowing like the wings of a vulture as he walked away from the altar, leaving her broken in the dust of her own dreams. If a soul is shattered at its most hopeful moment, can the pieces ever form a whole again? Chapter 5. The Flight of the Forsaken. The aftermath of the rejection was a blur of gray shadows and mocking whispers. Zara didn't remember leaving the altar. She only remembered the feeling of 1,000 eyes stinging her skin like needles. The Silver Moon Pack, her own people, looked away as she passed, their faces twisted with a mixture of pity and shame. She was no longer the miraculous healer or the chosen Luna. She was a defect, a woman so fundamentally broken that even a fated mate had cast her aside. Because she could no longer hear the comforting presence of her wolf, the world felt too loud, too sharp, and entirely too empty. She reached her small cottage on the edge of the village, the door swinging open on its rusted hinges. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The bundles of dried sage, the jars of tinctures, the quiet peace of a life she had once thought was enough. Now, it felt like a tomb. She moved through the rooms with jerky, mechanical motions, stripping off the silver gown that felt like a shroud. She threw it into the cold hearth, watching as the delicate lace caught fire and curled into blackened ash. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears, a cold, heavy stone sitting in the pit of her stomach. "You can't stay here, Zara." Alara's voice came from the doorway, thick with sorrow. Zara didn't turn around. She was busy shoving a few essential herbs and a sturdy cloak into a leather satchel. "I know," she whispered, her voice sounding like dead leaves skittering across a grave. The pack would never accept a rejected mate. Her presence would be a constant reminder of Kael's insult, a stain on their collective pride. She had seen what happened to women like her. They were pushed to the fringes, ignored until they faded away or were taken by the shadows. She refused to let that be her story. If she was to be destroyed, she would do it on her own terms, far away from the judging eyes of those who had once called her sister. "Where will you go?" Alara asked, stepping into the room and placing a hand on Zara's shoulder. Zara flinched at the touch. Any physical contact reminded her of the heat of Kael's palm, the way he had held her throat in the forest with a lethal tenderness. "To the Deadlands," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp, jagged edge. "To the rogue territories. If the world thinks I am a monster, I might as well live among them." Alara let out a small sob, but she didn't try to stop her. She knew that the Zara who had believed in fated love had died on that altar. The woman standing before her now was a creature of survival, forged in the fires of public humiliation. She stepped out into the night, the air tasting of impending rain and wood smoke. She didn't look back at the village, not even when she heard the distant, mournful howls of the pack beginning their evening hunt. She was no longer part of that rhythm. She was a ghost walking among the living, a healer who could no longer heal herself. Because she had lost her wolf, her senses were dull, the forest no longer speaking to her in the language of scents and vibrations. She felt vulnerable, a naked nerve exposed to the harshness of the wild, but she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The boundary of the Silver Moon territory was marked by a row of ancient, twisted oaks. As she crossed the line, a sudden, sharp pain flared in her chest, the final snap of the invisible tether that had bound her to her home. She gasped, clutching her satchel, and fell against a tree trunk. She waited for the fear to consume her, for the realization of her isolation to break her spirit. But instead, a cold, hard clarity began to settle over her. She was alone. She was unchosen. She was free. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to be anything to anyone. A twig snapped in the darkness behind her, and Zara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Without her wolf, she couldn't tell if it was a predator or merely a wandering deer. She reached into her belt, her fingers closing around the hilt of a small silver dagger she used for harvesting roots. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a woman who had nothing left to lose, and that made her more dangerous than any alpha. She stared into the darkness, her eyes narrowed, waiting for the shadow to reveal itself. "Go ahead," she hissed into the void, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. "Try to take what's left. I dare you." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a hidden threat. She didn't stay to find out what was watching her. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her feet flying over the uneven ground. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, putting miles of dark, tangled forest between herself and the man who had shattered her world. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Because if she stopped, the weight of the rejection would catch up to her, and she wasn't sure she would ever get back up. Is the freedom of the Forsaken worth the price of the soul?
Chapter 6. The Hollow King. Kael sat on his throne in the Obsidian Peak, the shadows of the great hall stretching out like long, accusatory fingers. The air was thick with the scent of stale wine and the metallic tang of his own blood, as he had spent the last 3 hours clawing at his chest in a desperate attempt to quiet the screaming in his head. Rejecting Zara had been a tactical necessity, an act of supreme iron will designed to protect his pack from the perceived weakness of his heart. But as the hours stretched into a day, the consequences of his choice began to manifest in ways he hadn't anticipated. His control, once absolute, was fraying at the edges like an old tapestry. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling with a fine, persistent tremor. This was the first sign of the instability, the physical manifestation of a broken bond. Because he was an alpha of the highest bloodline, the rejection hadn't just affected him, it was rippling through the entire Obsidian Peak. He could feel the agitation of his warriors, the way their loyalty was being tested by the erratic pulses of his aura. He had thought that by casting Zara aside, he would remain invulnerable. Instead, he had opened a void in the center of his power that was threatening to swallow him whole. "The border patrols report no sign of her, Alpha," his commander Thorn said from the base of the dais. Thorn's voice was neutral, but Kael could scent the underlying judgment, the sharp tang of disappointment that his leader had acted with such blatant cruelty. "Expand the search," Kael growled, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made the torches flicker. "She is a healer. She won't have gone far. She's likely hiding in some hovel, waiting for me to crawl back to her." He wanted to believe the lie. He wanted to believe that Zara was as weak as his fear dictated. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing on that altar, her face a mask of such pure, unadulterated agony that it made his own lungs seize. He had destroyed the only thing that had ever truly seen him, and the guilt was a poison that was slowly paralyzing his heart. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through his side, exactly where Zara had stitched his wound in the forest. He hissed, clutching his ribs, as the phantom sensation of her fingers flickered across his skin. It wasn't just a physical pain, it was an emotional echo, a remnant of the bond that refused to die. He had tried to kill it, but the bond was a primal force, as ancient and unstoppable as the tides. Because he had rejected his mate at her most vulnerable moment, the bond was now punishing him, turning his own strength into a weapon against him. "You should have mated her, Kael," a soft voice said from the shadows. Kael looked up to see his mother, the former Luna, standing near the hearth. Her eyes were filled with a profound sadness, the look of a woman who had seen the rise and fall of too many kings. "She was the anchor you needed. Now you are a ship lost in a hurricane, and you are taking your people down with you." Kael didn't respond. He couldn't. To admit she was right would be to admit that he was a coward, a man who had chosen a crown of ash over a life of warmth. He stood up, his furs swirling around him, and strode out of the hall, the sound of his boots echoing like a death knell. He walked out onto the battlements, the wind whipping his dark hair across his face. Below him, the lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars, but they offered him no comfort. He felt a sudden, violent urge to shift, to let the wolf take over and run until his human mind was silenced. He let out a roar, a sound of such profound frustration and self-hatred that it shook the very foundations of the castle. He was the high alpha of the Obsidian Peak, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, and yet he had never felt more like a failure. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words lost to the howling wind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried sprig of lavender he had found snagged in his cloak after the forest encounter. It still held a faint, lingering trace of her scent, the smell of healing and soft rain. He crushed it in his fist, the petals crumbling into dust, just as he had crushed her spirit. He realized then that he hadn't just rejected a mate. He had rejected his own humanity. He was now truly a monster, a king of a hollow mountain, waiting for the shadows he had created to finally come and claim him. As the moon reached its peak, a new sensation began to bleed through the wreckage of his mind. It was a sense of distance, a growing coldness that signaled Zara was moving further and further away. She was leaving the territories, heading into the lawless regions where even alphas feared to tread. A sudden, cold panic gripped his heart. If she died out there, if she was taken by the rogues or the predators, the bond would snap completely, and he would be lost to the madness of the unmated forever. "Thorn!" Kael roared, his voice carrying over the ramparts. "Ready the scouts. We leave at dawn." He didn't know if he was going to save her or to finish what he had started. He only knew that the silence in his soul was unbearable, and the only person who could break it was the woman he had just destroyed. He looked out over the dark, vast expanse of the forest, his eyes flashing a dangerous, desperate gold. The hunt was on. But this time the predator was the one being hunted by his own mistakes. Can a man who chose power over love ever find his way back to the light, or is he destined to rule a kingdom of ghosts? The journey into the dark has begun, and no one is coming back the same.
Chapter 7. The Border of Bone and Bramble. The transition from the manicured safety of the Silver Moon to the jagged lawlessness of the Deadlands felt like falling from a dream into a nightmare. Zara's boots, once kept clean by the paved paths of the infirmary, were now caked in a gray alkaline mud that smelled of stagnant sulfur and old rot. Every muscle in her body screamed in a protest of lactic acid and exhaustion, yet she pushed forward because the alternative was to let the coldness in her chest finally freeze her heart solid. Since the moment her wolf had gone silent, the world had lost its vibrant symphony of scents. Now, the forest didn't speak to her. It only threatened her with a heavy, oppressive silence. She moved through a thicket of skeletal trees whose branches clawed at her cloak like the fingers of the forgotten. This was rogue territory, a place where the concept of a mate was often a death sentence rather than a blessing. Zara clutched her satchel closer to her hip, the weight of her remaining tinctures offering a meager sense of security. Because she was no longer anchored by a pack bond, she felt a terrifying lightness, as if a strong wind could simply blow her existence away. She found a hollowed-out log near a trickle of oily water and collapsed into it, her breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was lined with glass. "No one owns me here," she whispered to the shadows, the words a jagged vow. The statement should have felt empowering, but in the damp chill of the twilight, it simply felt lonely. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of dried jerky, chewing it mechanically as she watched the mist roll across the forest floor. A sudden, sharp crack of a branch nearby made her freeze, her heart thumping a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. Without her wolf's heightened ears, she was functionally deaf to the nuances of the wild. She drew her silver dagger, the metal gleaming with a dull, moonlight-starved light, and waited for the predator to emerge from the haze. A lone wolf, its fur matted with burrs and dried blood, stepped into the small clearing. It wasn't a majestic beast of the high packs. It was a scavenger, its ribs showing through its mangy coat. It snarled, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of rabies or deep-seated lung infection. Zara didn't run. She couldn't. Instead, she felt a strange, detached surge of pity for the creature. It was just like her, cast out, broken, and surviving on the scraps of a world that had no place for the weak. "I have nothing for you but a quick death or a slow healing," she said, her voice steadying as her professional instincts took hold. The wolf lunged, but it was slow, its back leg dragging in the dirt. Zara dodged the clumsy strike, stepping behind the creature and bringing the hilt of her dagger down on the base of its skull. It collapsed with a pathetic whimper, its breathing shallow and labored. She looked at the animal, and for a moment, she saw the reflection of her own soul in its clouded eyes. She reached into her bag for a sedative root, her fingers moving with a practiced grace that her heartbreak couldn't erase. She was still a healer, even if she had no one left to heal but the monsters. As she worked on the wolf's leg, resetting the bone with a sharp snap that echoed through the trees, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since the altar. Purpose. She didn't need a mate to tell her she was valuable. She didn't need an alpha to validate her existence. Because she was capable of bringing order to the chaos of flesh, she held a power that Kael could never understand. She bandaged the limb with a strip of her own hem, watching as the animal's breathing evened out into a deep, drugged sleep. The moon climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. Zara leaned back against the log, her eyes heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than the bone. She thought of Kael, of the way his eyes had turned into chips of ice when he looked at her. He was likely sitting on his throne right now, surrounded by the warmth of his people, while she was bleeding her spirit out in the dirt. A cold, hard knot of resentment began to form in her gut, a seed of anger that promised to grow into something formidable. "I will survive this," she promised the darkness, her voice a low, vibrating hum. "And when I am whole again, you won't even be a memory." She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the rogue forest wash over her. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape, but it was honest. Here, there were no false promises of fated love, only the raw, visceral reality of the hunt. She drifted into a light, fitful sleep, her hand still resting on the hilt of her blade. Because she had been destroyed at her most vulnerable, she was now being rebuilt in the dark, out of iron and shadow and the stubborn will to exist. Is the absence of love a vacuum, or is it the space required for a queen to rise? Chapter 8. The Price of Mercy. The sun rose as a pale, sickly disk through the canopy of the Deadlands, offering no warmth to the woman huddled in the hollow of a tree. Zara woke with a start, her hand instinctively flying to her throat, checking for the phantom grip of a mate who was no longer there. The rogue wolf she had treated was gone, leaving behind only a flattened patch of grass and a lingering scent of musk and medicine. She stood up, her joints popping like dry twigs, and began the arduous process of finding water that wouldn't kill her. Because she was a daughter of the woods, she knew how to read the moss and the tilt of the land, finding a hidden spring tucked beneath a shelf of black rock. As the days bled into a week, Zara established a primitive, effective routine. She built a small lean-to against the rock face and spent her hours foraging for rare fungi and roots that grew only in the mineral-rich soil of the volcanic region. She was building a life out of the scraps of the wilderness, a solitary existence that was devoid of pack politics and the crushing weight of expectations. She found that without the constant mental noise of a bond, her focus was sharper, her connection to the earth more profound. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting, her soft edges hardening into something more resilient. "You have the touch of the moon on you, girl," a voice rasped from the shadows of the spring. Zara whirled around, her dagger already drawn. An old man, his skin the color of tanned leather and his eyes milky with cataracts, stood near the water. He was a rogue, but he didn't carry the stench of violence that usually accompanied the unaligned. He smelled of wood smoke and old secrets. Zara lowered her blade slightly, but she didn't sheath it. Because she had been betrayed by the highest of her kind, she wasn't about to trust the lowest. "I'm just a traveler," she replied, her voice sounding strange to her own ears after so much silence. The old man laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. "Travelers don't reset the legs of rogue wolves. Travelers don't know how to find the devil's tongue root without losing a finger." He stepped into the light, and Zara saw the faded mark of a healer on his forearm, a twin serpent entwined around a silver leaf. He was a cast-off, a man who had once served a pack and had been discarded when his eyes failed him. He was a mirror of her own future, and the sight of him made her heart ache with a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. He taught her things the Silver Moon healers had forgotten: how to use the vibration of the earth to sense approaching footsteps, how to mask her scent with the juice of crushed beetles, and how to heal wounds that were caused by silver-poisoned blades. In exchange, she shared her food and her fire. It was a partnership born of necessity, a quiet alliance in a world that wanted them dead. Because she was learning the secrets of the fringe, she was becoming more than a pack healer. She was becoming a witch of the Deadlands. "They will come for you, eventually," the old man said one night as they sat by the fire. "A woman with your power is a light in a very dark place, and there are those who would like to put that light in a cage." Zara looked into the flames, the orange light dancing in her dark eyes. She knew he was right. She could feel the shifts in the air, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath when the wind blew from the south. Kael would be looking for her, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to reclaim his stability. And the rogue alphas, the ones who ruled these territories with blood and bone, would eventually catch the scent of a high mate wandering their lands. She wasn't safe, but for the first time in her life, she felt capable of defending her own territory. A sudden low vibration hummed through the soles of her boots. The old man felt it too, his head cocked to the side like an owl. "Horses," he whispered. "Heavy ones, and the scent of iron." Zara stood up, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum. She didn't feel the panic that had consumed her at the altar. She felt a cold, clinical readiness. She reached for her satchel, checking the vials of paralysis powder and the blinding dust she had perfected over the last few days. She wasn't the girl who had waited to be chosen. She was the woman who had chosen to stay alive. She looked at the old man, a silent goodbye passing between them, and slipped into the shadows of the rock face. The riders burst into the clearing, their torches casting long, flickering shadows that turned the trees into giants. They weren't Kael's men. They wore the mismatched armor and cruel markings of the Iron Fang rogues. Their leader, a massive man with a jagged scar running from his eye to his jaw, hopped off his horse and sniffed the air. He turned his gaze toward the spring, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He didn't see Zara, but he could smell the lingering scent of her power. "I know you're here, little bird," he roared, his voice echoing off the stones. "You're worth more than a kingdom to the man who can break you." Zara stayed perfectly still, her breath shallow and controlled. She watched as they moved through her camp, trampling her drying herbs and smashing her clay jars. A slow, burning rage began to replace the coldness in her chest. They were destroying the only home she had left, the sanctuary she had built with her own blood and sweat. Because she was done being a victim, she stepped out of the shadows, her silver dagger reflecting the firelight. "You're in the wrong forest, Alpha," she said, her voice a low, lethal silk. The man turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected a confrontation. He had expected a cowering girl. He let out a bark of laughter and stepped toward her, his hand reaching for her hair. Zara didn't move until he was within arm's reach. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she threw a handful of fine, iridescent powder into his face. He screamed, clutching his eyes as the dust began to sear his retinas. His men lunged forward, but Zara was already a shadow among the trees, her knowledge of the terrain her greatest weapon. She led them on a frantic, deadly chase through the brambles, using the traps she had set for game to snare their ankles and the low-hanging branches to dismount them. She wasn't fighting like a wolf. She was fighting like the forest itself. One by one, the riders fell, their cries of pain muffled by the thick mist. When only the leader remained, stumbling blindly through the brush, Zara stepped out in front of him. She didn't kill him. She simply watched as he collapsed into the mud, his pride shattered along with his vision. "Tell your masters," she whispered, leaning down so he could hear the ice in her voice. "The healer is dead. There is only the Deadlands now." She turned and walked away, not looking back at the wreckage she had left behind. She felt a strange, terrifying exhilaration pulsing through her veins. She had defended herself. She had won. But as she reached the safety of the upper ridges, a new scent hit her, one that made her heart stop in her chest. It was the smell of smoke, leather, and a dark, underlying musk. Kael was close, and he wasn't alone. Is the strength found in solitude a shield, or just a target for a larger hunter? Chapter 9. The Shadow of the Crown. The smell of Kael was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made Zara's skin crawl with a mixture of desire and disgust. She stood on the high ridge, looking down into the valley where the Iron Fang rogues had been defeated. Below her, a new group of riders had entered the clearing, men in polished black plate, their horses moving with a disciplined precision that marked them as Obsidian Peak elites. At their head was Kael, his black furs billowing in the wind, his golden eyes scanning the ground with a frantic, desperate intensity. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, his face gaunt, and his shoulders tight with a tension that radiated off him in waves. Zara crouched behind a jagged outcrop, her breath held tight in her lungs. She didn't want him to find her. She wasn't ready to face the man who had torn her world apart, not when she was still stitching the pieces of herself back together. Because she was no longer linked to him, she could see him clearly for the first time, not as a fated mate, but as a ruler who was falling apart because he had lost his anchor. She watched as he knelt in the mud where she had fought the rogue alpha, his fingers tracing the indentation of her boot print with a reverence that felt like a mockery. She was here. Kael's voice carried up the ridge, sounding broken and raw. She fought them. My Zara fought them alone. The "my" in his sentence hit Zara like a slap. She wasn't his. She belonged to the dirt and the rain and the silence of the Deadlands. She watched as he stood up, his aura flaring with a violent golden light that sent his warriors back a step. He was a king in the middle of a collapse, a predator who had realized too late that he had eaten his own heart. A part of her wanted to laugh at his misery, to scream down the mountain that he was too late. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the way he had leaned his forehead against hers in the forest, felt a treacherous, aching pull. "Spread out!" Kael roared, his voice echoing through the valley like a thunderclap. "She can't have gone far. Bring her to me. But if anyone lays a hand on her, I will flay the skin from their bones." Zara didn't wait to hear more. She turned and began to climb higher into the peaks where the air was thin and the stone was slick with ice. She needed to reach the Cave of Whispers, a place where the mountain's electromagnetic field would mask her scent from even the most skilled trackers. Because she was a healer, she knew the geography of the body and the earth were the same. She just had to find the hidden veins of the mountain and follow them to the heart. She moved with a desperate, frantic speed, her fingers bleeding as she gripped the sharp edges of the slate. As she reached the entrance to the cave, a hand shot out of the darkness and grabbed her arm. Zara let out a strangled cry and swung her dagger, but her attacker was faster, pinning her against the cold stone wall. She looked up, expecting to see a rogue or one of Kael's men. Instead, she found herself staring into the cruel, calculating eyes of a man she had only heard of in ghost stories, the Rogue King, Silas. He was beautiful in a way that felt like a poison, his skin pale as bone, and his hair the color of dried blood. "A high mate in my mountains," Silas purred, his voice a low, melodic vibration that made Zara's teeth ache. "And such a fierce one, too. I watched you break those iron fangs. You have a very interesting way of healing, little bird." Zara struggled against his grip, but it was like fighting a statue. Silas was an alpha who had been forged in the chaos of the Deadlands, a man who had no pack but commanded the loyalty of thousands through sheer, unadulterated fear. Because he didn't care about the laws of the Moon Mother, he was the only man in the world who could truly challenge Kael. He looked at the marks on Zara's neck, the faded scars of the rejection, and a slow, dark smile spread across his face. "He threw you away," Silas whispered, his thumb brushing over the scarred skin. The high alpha of Obsidian looked at a diamond and thought it was coal. How very fortunate for me. Zara felt a cold, paralyzing dread wash over her. She was caught between two monsters, one who wanted to own her out of guilt, and one who wanted to use her as a weapon of war. She looked at Silas, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp clarity. She wasn't a prize to be won or a tool to be wielded. She was Zara. And if she had to burn the entire mountain down to prove it, she would. She reached for the small vial of concentrated belladonna hidden in her sleeve, her fingers trembling with a lethal intent. "You're worth more than you think, healer," Silas said, his grip tightening as he heard the approach of Kael's men in the distance. "You're the key to his destruction, and I think it's time you started acting like it." He didn't wait for her to respond. He threw her over his shoulder like a sack of grain and vanished into the deep, lightless tunnels of the cave. Zara caught one last glimpse of the valley below, where the torches of Kael's army flickered like a dying fire. She wanted to scream, to call out to the man who had broken her, to beg him to save her from this new nightmare. But as the darkness swallowed her whole, she realized that the only person who could save Zara was the woman she had become in the Deadlands. The hunt had changed again. The predator was now the prize, and the game was about to get much, much deadlier. Is the enemy of my enemy a friend, or just a different kind of cage? The answer lay in the heart of the mountain, where the whispers were about to become a roar. Chapter 10. The Echo of the Hunt. The damp, suffocating darkness of the subterranean tunnels pressed against Zara's skin like a physical weight, a stark contrast to the vast, unforgiving sky of the Deadlands she had briefly claimed as her own. Silas moved with a fluid, terrifying silence, his shoulder biting into her ribs as he navigated the labyrinthine guts of the mountain. Because she was a healer, she could feel the unnatural rhythm of his heart, slow, steady, and utterly devoid of the frantic heat that usually defined an alpha's pulse. Every bump against the stone walls sent a jolt of pain through her bruised hip, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a whimper. "You can stop struggling, little bird," Silas murmured, his voice echoing off the wet limestone like a dripping faucet. "Your king is currently tearing the forest apart 3 miles behind us. He's searching for a girl who doesn't exist anymore, while I am holding the woman who took her place." Zara went still, her mind racing through the pharmacopoeia of her memory, searching for a combination of herbs that could take down a man who seemed more ghost than wolf. She realized that Silas didn't want her for her bloodline or her beauty. He wanted her because she was the only wound Kael couldn't stitch shut. Because Kael had publicly rejected her, she had become a symbol of his fallibility, a living testament to the fact that the high alpha of the Obsidian Peak could be broken. She felt a cold, jagged spike of resentment, not at Silas for kidnapping her, but at Kael for making her such an easy target. They emerged into a cavern illuminated by the eerie, phosphorescent glow of bioluminescent fungi that clung to the ceiling like emerald stars. It was a cathedral of the damned, filled with the scent of ozone and ancient, stagnant water. Silas dropped her onto a pile of furs that smelled faintly of cedar and old blood, his eyes tracking her every movement with a scholarly detachment. Zara scrambled back, her hand instinctively flying to the hidden pocket in her tunic, but her fingers found only torn fabric. Her satchel, her tinctures, her silver dagger, they were all gone, swallowed by the mountain or stolen by the rogue king. "He's coming for you, you know," Silas said, leaning against a stalagmite and crossing his arms over his chest. "Not because he loves you, not even because he wants you. He's coming because he's losing his mind, and he thinks you're the medicine." Zara looked at him, her eyes narrowing into slits of forest green fire. "He's coming because he's a predator," she spat, her voice raspy from the dust of the tunnels. "And predators don't like it when someone steals their kill." She saw a flicker of amusement cross Silas's pale features, a brief crack in his porcelain mask. He stepped closer, the temperature in the cave dropping as he entered her personal space. He reached out to touch a strand of her hair, but she jerked away, her teeth bared in a silent, feral snarl. A sudden, distant roar shook the cavern, a sound of such profound, agonizing fury that it made the emerald fungi flicker and die. It was Kael. He had found the entrance to the tunnels, and his wolf was screaming for the soul he had discarded. Zara felt a treacherous, involuntary shiver race down her spine, the phantom remnants of the bond vibrating in her marrow like a struck tuning fork. Because she had once loved the man making that sound, she knew exactly how much destruction he was capable of when his pride was at stake. "Hear that?" Silas whispered, his eyes glowing with a sudden manic light. "That is the sound of an empire cracking, and you, Zara, are the wedge." He turned away to bark orders at his silent, shadow-clad guards, leaving Zara alone in the green-tinted gloom. She looked at her hands, the fingers that had once been dedicated to preserving life, and felt a strange new power coiling in her gut. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't a wedge. She was the one who knew exactly where the mountain was weak. Because she understood the anatomy of a collapse, she began to look for the structural flaws in Silas's sanctuary, her mind working with a cold, clinical precision that would have terrified the girl she used to be. Is the man who hunts you more dangerous than the man who hides you?
Chapter 11. The Shattered Mirror. Kael stood at the mouth of the Cave of Whispers, his chest heaving as if he had run across the world without taking a single breath. His leathers were shredded. His knuckles were raw from punching through the stone barriers the rogues had erected, and his eyes were no longer gold. They were a swirling, chaotic amber that signaled the total loss of his human restraint. Because he had spent the last week tracking the scent of mint and lavender through the mud of the Deadlands, he had become a creature of pure, unadulterated instinct. He didn't care about the Obsidian Peak. He didn't care about the brewing war with the southern packs. He only cared about the fact that the air smelled of Silas's rot and Zara's fear. "Alpha, the tunnels are unstable," Thorn cautioned, grabbing Kael's shoulder to hold him back. "If you shift now, you'll bring the entire mountain down on her head." Kael whirled around, his hand clamping onto Thorn's throat with enough force to make the veteran warrior gasp. "She is in there," Kael growled, his voice a distorted, multitonal rasp. "He has his hands on her. He is touching the woman I—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The word love felt like a silver blade in his throat, a truth he was still trying to reject even as it bled him dry. He released Thorn, who stumbled back, coughing and rubbing his neck. He looked back into the dark maw of the cave, the silence of the mountain mocking his desperation. Every second she was with Silas was a second that the bond, the broken, jagged thing he had tried to kill, lashed him with a whip of pure agony. Because he had rejected her at the altar, he had no right to the protection the bond should have provided. He was flying blind, guided only by the lingering heat of her presence and the crushing weight of his own guilt. He realized with a sickening clarity that he hadn't just lost a mate. He had lost his moral compass, and he was spinning into the dark. "I found this near the entrance," a scout said, stepping forward and holding out a small, crushed vial. Kael took it, his fingers trembling as he recognized the scent of the paralysis powder Zara had been perfecting. It was a sign of her strength, a proof that she hadn't gone quietly into the shadows. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through his rage, the way she had looked at him in the forest clearing, her hands steady as she stitched his side, her eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful empathy. He had called that empathy a weakness. He had thought her healing nature made her unfit for a king. Because he had been a fool, he had traded a diamond for a throne of salt. "Tell the men to hold the perimeter," Kael commanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "I am going in alone. Silas won't kill her. He'll use her as bait, and I intend to be the hungriest thing that takes it." He stepped into the darkness, the cool air of the cave swallowing him whole. He didn't use a torch. He relied on the infrared heat of the living and the vibrations of the stone. As he moved deeper, he began to feel the shift in the atmosphere, the ozone and stagnant water of the Rogue King's domain. Silas was an alpha of shadows, a man who thrived on the psychological erosion of his enemies. Kael knew that this wasn't going to be a battle of claws and teeth. It was going to be a confrontation with the truth he had tried to burn at the altar. He reached the first intersection, his nostrils flaring. He caught a scent that made his heart stop, not Zara's fear, but her anger. It was a sharp, biting fragrance like ozone before a storm. She wasn't a cowering girl waiting to be rescued. She was a storm in a cage, and she was already beginning to rain lightning on her captors. A strange, twisted sense of pride flared in Kael's chest. He had wanted a queen who could stand beside him, and he had created a goddess who might just destroy him. "Zara," he whispered, the name a prayer and a plea. The cave didn't answer. It only whispered back the sound of his own heavy footsteps and the drip, drip, drip of water that sounded like the ticking of a clock. Because he had chosen power over her, he was now the most powerful man in a world that felt entirely empty. He pushed forward, his claws extending, ready to tear the heart out of the mountain if it meant seeing her face one more time. If you find the treasure you threw away, do you have the right to claim it again?
Chapter 12. The Price of the Second Choice. The encounter happened at the edge of the bioluminescent cavern, a place where the green light met the absolute black of the deep tunnels. Zara was standing by a stone basin, her hands coated in a strange, glowing lichen she had scraped from the walls. She heard him before she saw him, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a heart that beat in sync with her own, despite everything she had done to silence it. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The air in the room suddenly became hypercharged, the molecules vibrating with a familiar, suffocating intensity. "Zara?" Kael's voice cracked through the silence, sounding more like a sob than a name. She turned slowly, her expression as cold and immovable as the stalactites above. Kael was standing 10 feet away, a wreckage of a man, his golden eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. He looked at her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling into the abyss, his hand reaching out as if to touch a ghost. Zara didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with the detached curiosity of a healer examining a terminal wound. "You look terrible, Alpha," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless silk. Kael flinched as if she had struck him. He stepped closer, the heat of his body radiating across the distance. I thought I had lost you. Silas, he stopped, his gaze falling on the glowing lichen on her hands. "Did he hurt you? I will kill him. I will tear him apart for touching you." The irony of his statement was a bitter poison in Zara's mouth. He wanted to kill Silas for touching her, but he was the one who had shattered her soul into 1,000 pieces. "He didn't hurt me, Kael," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp, jagged edge. "He just showed me what I was worth to a man who isn't afraid of his own heart. He didn't reject me because I was a weakness. He saw me as a weapon." She saw the realization hit him, the way his shoulders slumped as the weight of his own failure finally crushed him. He fell to his knees in the damp dirt, his head bowed, his hands clenching into fists. "I was afraid," Kael whispered, the confession coming out as a broken rasp. "I thought if I loved you, I would be weak. I thought I was protecting the pack by staying cold, but I was just a coward. I am a coward, Zara. Please, come home." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the ghosts of everything they had lost. Zara looked at the man she had once dreamed of mating, the man who had been her fated match, and she felt nothing but a profound, weary distance. Because she had survived the Deadlands, she no longer needed his protection. Because she had healed herself in the dark, she no longer needed his warmth. She stepped toward him, but not to comfort him. She stopped just out of reach, looking down at his bowed head. "You found the truth," she said, her voice a low, lethal hum. "You rejected me because you were afraid of death. You chose your own survival over our bond. So I was worth loving, just not worth risking?" Kael looked up, his eyes swimming with tears of pure, unadulterated shame. "Yes," he choked out. "And it is the greatest mistake of my life. I will spend every breath I have left proving it to you. I will give you the Obsidian Peak. I will give you my life. Just look at me like you used to." Zara let out a small, hollow laugh that echoed through the cavern. She reached out and touched his jaw, her fingers cold against his burning skin. For a fraction of a second, the bond flared, a bright, agonizing flash of what could have been. Then, she pulled her hand away, the connection snapping like an overextended wire. She looked him directly in the eye, her forest green gaze as hard as emerald. "You don't get to choose me twice, Kael," she said, her voice a final, absolute sentence. "The first time was fate. The second time is a consequence. And right now, the consequence is that I am leaving." A sudden shadow detached itself from the wall behind Zara. Silas. He had been watching them, a silent witness to their emotional carnage. He stepped forward, his pale hand resting on Zara's shoulder in a possessive, mocking gesture. Kael roared, his shift beginning in a violent explosion of fur and bone. But Silas didn't flinch. He just looked at Kael with a cold, triumphant smile. "She chose the Deadlands over your peak, Alpha," Silas purred. "Maybe it's time you learned what it's like to be unchosen." The cavern exploded into chaos as the two alphas lunged for each other, but Zara didn't stay to watch the fight. She turned and vanished into the side tunnels, her heart a cold, steady stone in her chest. She had delivered her verdict. Now, she was going to write her own ending. Is a king's redemption worth a queen's peace? The mountain began to groan as the battle shook its foundations, a herald of the destruction yet to come. Chapter 13. The Grip of the Iron Cage. The tremors shaking the cavern ceiling were not merely the product of shifting tectonic plates, but the visceral manifestation of two alphas attempting to erase each other from existence. Zara moved through the secondary tunnels with a frantic, focused energy, her lungs burning as she inhaled the particulate dust of pulverizing limestone. She had left Kael on his knees, and Silas in his arrogance, but the mountain was a fickle witness to their masculine posturing, because the structural integrity of the Cave of Whispers was being compromised by their raw power. The exit she had planned to use was now a jagged wall of fallen debris. She skidded to a halt, her palms stinging as she pressed them against the cold, unyielding stone that blocked her path to the surface. "Looking for a way out, little bird?" A voice rasped from the shadows behind her. Zara spun around, her fingers instantly seeking the jagged piece of flint she had secreted in her waistband. It wasn't Silas or Kael who stepped into the dim, green light of the phosphorescent fungi. It was the scarred leader of the Iron Fang Rogues, the man she had blinded with her powder in the valley. His eyes were milky and weeping, his face a roadmap of chemical burns, yet he moved with a terrifying, sensory-driven precision. He wasn't hunting with sight. He was hunting with the pure, unadulterated hatred that only a humiliated alpha can harbor. Because she had stripped him of his pride, he was here to strip her of her breath. "I can smell your heart," the rogue hissed, his nostrils flaring as he tracked the scent of her adrenaline. "It sounds like a trapped bird beating against a cage. How poetic that you'll die in one." He lunged with a speed that defied his injuries, his massive, clawed hand snapping shut around Zara's throat. She was lifted off her feet, her boots kicking uselessly against his armored shins as the air was cut off in a brutal, agonizing squeeze. This wasn't the tempered grip of a mate or the calculated hold of a kidnapper. This was the crushing force of an executioner. Zara's vision began to gray at the edges, the bioluminescent green of the cave turning into a muddy, suffocating black. She jabbed the flint into his forearm, but he didn't even flinch, his fingers tightening until she heard the sickening creak of her own cartilage. "Alpha!" a voice roared, the sound vibrating through the very stone of the tunnel. The grip on Zara's throat suddenly vanished as a blur of black fur and silver muscle slammed into the rogue leader. Kael had arrived, not as a man pleading for a second chance, but as a beast of pure, catastrophic vengeance. He didn't shift fully. He remained in a monstrous, half-human state, his claws dripping with the blood of the guards he had torn through to reach her. He pinned the rogue against the wall, his teeth bared in a snarl that sounded like grinding metal. Zara collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her hands clutching her bruised neck as she watched the predator she had tried to leave behind save her life for the third time. "You touched what is mine," Kael growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble that made Zara's teeth ache. The rogue leader didn't have time to scream before Kael's claws found his throat. It was a clinical, efficient kill, a display of dominance that left no room for mercy. Kael turned toward Zara, his eyes still glowing with a manic, predatory amber. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but he stopped when he saw the sheer, unbridled terror in her gaze. He looked down at his blood-stained fingers, and then back at her. The realization of his own monstrosity hitting him like a physical blow. Because he had become the very thing she feared, he couldn't even offer her a hand to help her up. "I didn't come to claim you," Kael whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that felt more dangerous than his rage. I came to keep you alive, even if you hate me for it. Zara looked at the dead man at her feet, and then at the monster who had killed him. She felt the weight of the chains tightening, not of iron, but of an obligation she never asked for. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and looked Kael in the eye. She saw the devotion, the madness, and the desperate, aching love he was finally allowing himself to feel. But as the mountain groaned again, threatening to bury them both, she realized that survival was the only currency that mattered in the dark. Is a rescue a gift, or just a different way to be captured?
Chapter 14. The Weight of the Debt. Kael watched Zara move away from him, her posture rigid and her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Every step she took away from him felt like a literal tearing of his flesh, a phantom amputation that left him bleeding internally. He followed her at a distance, his senses dialed to their absolute limit, scanning every shadow for Silas's remaining men. He knew he had no right to her company, no claim to her affection, and yet the bond, that stubborn, immortal thread, was pulling at his navel with a force that bordered on physical pain. Because he had failed her so spectacularly at the altar, he was now relegated to the role of a silent guardian, a ghost haunting the periphery of her life. "Why didn't you fight for me like this before?" Zara's voice cut through the silence, sharp and jagged as a broken vial. She didn't stop walking, didn't even turn to look at him. But the question hung in the air like a poisonous mist. Kael felt his throat tighten, the words he had suppressed for years finally clamoring for release. "Because I was a coward," he admitted, the truth tasting like copper in his mouth. "I thought that if I admitted I needed you, the world would see the weakness in my armor. I thought being an alpha meant standing alone. I didn't realize that without you, there was nothing left worth standing for." He saw her shoulders hitch, a brief microscopic tremor that told him his words had landed. But she didn't soften. She kept moving through the narrow crevice, her movements fluid and efficient. "You risked the pack for your pride," she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "And now you're risking your life for a woman who doesn't want you. Is this redemption, Kael? Or is it just another form of ego?" The cruelty of her words was a necessary cauterization, a way to keep the wound of their connection from festering. They reached a steep incline where the path narrowed to a mere ledge over a black, bottomless chasm. The air was thin here, biting cold and smelling of ancient ice. Kael stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady her as she navigated the slick stone. Zara stopped, her gaze falling on his hand. She didn't take it. She looked at his palm, scarred and calloused, and then up at his face. For a moment, the mask of the healer slipped, and he saw the woman who had once looked at him with stars in her eyes. "I can't go back to the peak, Kael," she whispered, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "The woman who lived there is dead. You killed her." "Then we won't go back," Kael replied, the decision forming in his mind with a sudden, crystalline clarity. "We'll go wherever you want. I'll abdicate. I'll burn the crown. I'll be a rogue in the Deadlands if it means I get to breathe the same air as you." He meant it. He would trade the empire he had built with his own blood for a single night of peace in her presence. Because he had finally learned that power was a hollow god, he was ready to become a heretic. A sudden, sharp whistle echoed through the canyon, followed by the rhythmic thud of arrows hitting the stone near their feet. Silas hadn't given up. The rogue king's archers were perched on the ridges above, their black-fletched shafts seeking the gaps in Kael's armor. Kael didn't think. He lunged forward, throwing his body over Zara's, shielding her from the rain of steel with his own back. He felt the bite of an arrow in his shoulder, a hot, searing line of pain, but he didn't move. He held her against the cold rock, his heart hammering against hers, a frantic, shared rhythm in the face of death. "Run!" Kael commanded, shoving her toward a small cave opening tucked behind a waterfall of ice. "I'll hold them off, just go." Zara looked at the arrow protruding from his shoulder, the dark blood already staining his furs. She looked at the desperation in his eyes, the absolute willingness to die so that she could live. For the first time since the rejection, She felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a recognition of the sacrifice. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wound in his shoulder, her healer's instinct warring with her survivor's rage. "You're a fool, Kael of Obsidian," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the wind. "I know," he gasped, his teeth bared as he drew his sword to face the descending rogues. "But I'm your fool." He turned away from her, a wall of muscle and iron standing between her and the darkness. As the first of Silas's men hit the ledge, Kael let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the mountain. He fought with a suicidal grace, his blade a blur of silver light in the twilight. He wasn't fighting for a kingdom anymore. He was fighting for a chance to be remembered as something other than the man who broke her. If a man gives his life to save yours, does he buy back the soul he sold?
Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. The air inside the ice cave was silent, a crystalline tomb that amplified the sounds of the slaughter happening just outside the entrance. Zara stood in the shadows, her hands trembling as she clutched a handful of snow to her bruised throat. She could hear Kael's roars, the wet thud of blades meeting flesh, and the high-pitched screams of the dying. Every sound was a hammer blow against the wall she had built between herself and the bond. She wanted to keep running, to vanish into the white wastes and never look back. But because she was a healer, the sound of his pain was a siren song she couldn't ignore. She peered around the edge of the ice, her breath catching in her throat. Kael was a wreckage. He was standing in the center of the ledge, surrounded by a dozen bodies, his body riddled with arrows like a pincushion. He was swaying on his feet, his sword arm heavy and slow, but he refused to drop. Silas stood at the far end of the ledge, his pale face twisted into a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. He held a crossbow leveled at Kael's heart, the bolt tipped with a shimmering, iridescent liquid that Zara recognized instantly. "Silver rot," she whispered, the horror of it paralyzing her. It was a slow, agonizing poison that turned a shifter's blood into acid, melting them from the inside out while they remained conscious. It was a coward's weapon, and Silas was using it to finish the man who had dared to challenge his shadow kingdom. Kael looked at Silas, his eyes glazed with exhaustion and blood loss, and then he turned his head toward the cave. He didn't see Zara in the darkness, but he smiled, a small, sad tilting of his lips that said everything he had never been able to voice. He was ready to take the bolt so she could have her head start. "Goodbye, little bird," Silas called out, his finger tightening on the trigger. The world seemed to slow down, the individual snowflakes hanging in the air like diamonds. Zara felt a sudden, violent eruption in her chest. Not the bond, but a raw, human refusal to let this be the end. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have her wolf, but she had the knowledge of the earth. She reached out and grabbed a massive, overhanging icicle, her fingers screaming as the sub-zero temperature burned her skin. With a roar of her own, she put every ounce of her resentment and her strength into a single, downward pull. The ice didn't just break, it detonated. The vibration of the snap triggered a localized avalanche, a wall of white powder and jagged frozen spears that swept across the ledge. Silas let out a yelp of surprise as the bolt went wide, skittering harmlessly into the abyss. The rogue king was swept off his feet, disappearing into the swirling white chaos. Kael, already on the brink of collapse, was buried under the fringe of the slide, his body disappearing beneath a drift of heavy, suffocating snow. Zara scrambled out of the cave, her hands clawing at the frozen ground as she reached the spot where Kael had been standing. "Kael!" she screamed, her voice raw and panicked. "Kael! Answer me!" She began to dig, her fingernails breaking and bleeding as she threw aside chunks of ice and packed powder. She didn't care about the rogues, she didn't care about Silas, and she didn't care about her pride. She only cared about the heat she could still feel beneath the surface, a flickering, dying coal that she refused to let go out. She found his hand first, cold, gray, and unresponsive. She pulled with everything she had, dragging his massive frame from the snow. He was blue, his breathing stopped, his heart a silent stone in his chest. Zara collapsed over him, her hands moving frantically across his chest, her mind a blur of medical protocols and desperate prayers. She pressed her lips to his, blowing air into his frozen lungs, her tears falling onto his scarred cheeks. "Don't you dare!" she sobbed, pounding on his chest. "You don't get to die now! You don't get to leave me with this debt! Breathe, you stubborn, arrogant fool! Breathe!" She felt a sudden electric spark beneath her palms, a surge of energy that felt like a lightning strike. The bond, which had been a jagged, broken thing, suddenly fused. It wasn't the soft glow of a mating. It was a violent, searing cauterization. Kael's eyes snapped open, his chest heaving as he took a ragged, agonizing breath. He looked up at her, his vision clearing, and saw the woman who had just saved his life again. "Zara," he wheezed, his hand weakly rising to touch her tear-stained face. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his as the blizzard raged around them. They were broken, they were hunted, and they were lost in a frozen wasteland. But as the bond hummed between them, a low, steady vibration of shared survival, Zara realized that the story wasn't over. It was just getting started. Can a bond forged in fire survive a winter of the soul? The answer lay in the silence that followed the storm, where two ghosts were trying to become human again. Chapter 16. The Fragile Ghost of Peace. The silence that followed the avalanche was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. Zara sat in the mouth of a shallow limestone alcove, her hands buried in the thick, blood-matted fur of Kael's cloak to keep from shaking. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of skeletal white and bruised purple shadows, but the cold remained a predator, nipping at the exposed skin of her neck. Because she had spent the last hour dragging Kael's unconscious body into this sliver of shelter, her own muscles felt like frayed ropes, ready to snap at the slightest tension. She watched the shallow, hitching rise of his chest, her healer's mind tallying the cost of his devotion in broken ribs and silver-tainted lacerations. "Why are you still here, Zara?" Kael's voice was a ghostly rasp, barely audible over the whistle of the wind through the crags. He didn't open his eyes, his face pale as the frost dusting the stones around them. Zara didn't answer immediately. She was busy grinding a dried stimulant root between two flat rocks, her fingers stiff and clumsy. She felt the bond humming in the back of her skull, no longer a screaming siren of betrayal, but a low, rhythmic throb of shared exhaustion. Because he had nearly died for her, the absolute wall she had built around her heart had developed a hairline fracture, a leak of empathy that she found utterly terrifying. She reached out and pressed the bitter paste against his lips, her touch clinical and detached, though her pulse betrayed her by fluttering against her own throat. "I am a healer, Kael," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and hollow in the vast emptiness of the mountain. "I don't leave people to rot in the snow, even the ones who deserve it." The cruelty of her words lacked its previous edge, sounding more like a tired habit than a genuine strike. She watched him swallow the medicine, a grimace of pain flitting across his features before his breathing leveled out. He was a wreckage of a king, a man who had traded his pride for a handful of snow and a chance to be looked at with something other than hatred. A sudden, sharp howl echoed from the valley below. Not the healthy cry of a pack on the hunt, but the jagged, desperate sound of a rogue seeking blood. Silas was still alive, or at least his shadows were. Zara felt a cold dread settle in her marrow, a realization that their sanctuary was nothing more than a temporary tomb. Because they were both wounded and depleted, they were a feast waiting to happen for the scavengers of the Deadlands. She looked at Kael, seeing the way his hand twitched toward the hilt of his broken sword, even in his semi-conscious state. "They're coming," Kael murmured, his golden eyes flickering open, glazed with fever but sharp with an old ingrained lethality. "You need to leave me, Zara. Take the high pass. The snow will cover your scent if you move now." He tried to sit up, a groan of pure agony escaping his lips as his silver-burned shoulder protested the movement. He looked at her with a desperate, pleading intensity, a man who was ready to be the bait one last time. "Be quiet," Zara commanded, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp authority that made him blink. "You've done enough choosing for both of us. If we stay here, we die. If we move, we might just reach the rogue boundary before the moon peaks." Because she had learned the geography of the Deadlands from the old man, she knew of a hidden trail that bypassed the main valley. She stood up, offering him her shoulder, her small frame braced to take the weight of a falling empire. He looked at her hand, his expression a chaotic mix of shame and a hope so bright it was painful to witness. He took it, his massive fingers closing around hers, with a gentleness that felt like a prayer. As she pulled him to his feet, the bond flared, a warm, golden light that briefly pushed back the biting chill of the mountain. It wasn't a restoration of what they had lost. It was the birth of something new, something forged in the wreckage of their mutual destruction. They stepped out into the white waste together, two ghosts haunted by the lives they had outgrown. Is the mercy of a victim a sign of weakness, or the ultimate display of power?
Chapter 17. The Echo of Failure. Kael moved through the waist-deep powder like a man walking through a dream. His reality narrowed down to the warmth of Zara's shoulder beneath his arm and the rhythmic crunch of snow. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, the silver rot in his system beginning to leach the strength from his bones. He knew he was failing. He could feel the edges of his consciousness fraying, the darkness of the mountain beckoning him to just lay down and let the ice take the pain away. But because Zara was holding him, he forced his heart to keep beating, a stubborn, irrational muscle that refused to give up on the woman it had once discarded. "I can smell them, Zara," Kael wheezed, his head lolling against her temple. "3, maybe 4. They're circling. They know I'm fading." He felt her grip tighten on his waist, her small fingers digging into the leather of his tunic. She didn't speak, her focus entirely on the treacherous path ahead, but he could feel the frantic electric energy of her mind through the bond. She was calculating, measuring their distance against the stamina of a dying man. Because he had been an alpha for so long, the feeling of being protected, of being the one who was vulnerable, was a profound ego-stripping humiliation. He looked at the side of her face, the way the wind had turned her cheeks a vivid, stinging red, and felt a surge of self-hatred that burned hotter than the silver rot. "I failed you," he whispered, the words slurring as his tongue grew heavy. "I failed the pack. I failed everything." "Stop talking, Kael," Zara snapped, though her voice caught on a sob she tried to hide as a cough. "Save your breath for walking. You don't get to apologize your way out of this. You don't get the easy path of a martyr." The harshness of her tone was a lifeline, a jagged hook that kept him tethered to the present. She dragged him over a fallen pine, her breathing coming in ragged, wet gasps that mirrored his own. They were two broken halves of a whole that no longer fit together, trying to survive a world that had moved on without them. A sudden shadow detached itself from a cluster of ice-covered rocks 10 yards ahead. It wasn't Silas, but a massive, mangy rogue with one eye and a jaw that had been shattered and reset at a crooked angle. The creature didn't shift. It remained in its wolf form, a beast of pure, unadulterated hunger. It snarled, the sound a low-frequency vibration that made the snow shimmer. Kael felt his wolf surge, a desperate, dying roar of instinct, but his body wouldn't follow. He fell to his knees, his legs finally giving out, dragging Zara down into the snow with him. "Zara, run!" Kael gasped, his hand groping for a rock, a branch, anything to use as a weapon. The rogue stepped closer, its saliva freezing into long crystalline threads that hung from its jowls. It ignored Kael, its singular milky eye fixed on Zara. She was the prize, the high mate whose blood carried the scent of 2 empires. Zara didn't run. She stood up, stepping in front of Kael, her silver dagger held in a trembling but determined grip. She looked small, fragile, and utterly doomed against the massive predator. Because Kael couldn't protect her, he felt his soul begin to splinter, the final, absolute failure of his existence. "Get back!" Zara screamed at the beast, her voice a shrill, desperate command. The rogue lunged, a blur of matted fur and yellow teeth. Kael closed his eyes, unable to watch the end, his hand clawing at the snow in a silent, agonizing scream of his own. He heard the sound of the impact, the wet thud of a blade, and a high-pitched yelp of pain. But when he opened his eyes, Zara wasn't dead. She was standing over the rogue, her dagger buried in its neck, her face covered in a spray of hot, dark blood. She was shaking, her eyes wide and glassy, but she had won. She had become the hunter in the dark. "I told you," she gasped, her voice breaking as she looked down at the twitching beast. "No one owns me here." Kael looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see his mate or his healer. He saw a queen who had been forged in the fires of his own betrayal. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hem of her blood-stained cloak, a gesture of absolute unconditional submission. He realized then that he hadn't been searching for a way to save her. He had been searching for a way to be worthy of her saving him. If the protector is destroyed, does the protected become the monster?
Chapter 18. The Acceptance of the End. The blood on Zara's face was already starting to freeze, a sticky, copper-scented mask that made her skin feel tight and foreign. She didn't feel the triumph of the kill. She only felt a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull her down into the snow beside the rogue. She looked at Kael, who was watching her with a look of such raw, unshielded reverence that she had to turn away. Because she had just taken a life to save his, the debt between them had become a tangled, inextricable knot. She wiped her dagger on the rogue's fur, her movements mechanical and cold, her mind a blank slate of survival. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice a flat, dead thing. She helped him up again, her body acting on an instinct that she no longer had the strength to question. The trail began to descend, the air growing slightly thicker and smelling of damp pine and wood smoke. They were reaching the lower reaches of the rogue territory, a place where the mountain's grip began to loosen. But as the physical danger receded, the emotional reality of their situation began to settle over them like a second blizzard. They were two people with no home, no pack, and a bond that was a constant, aching reminder of everything they had lost. "Zara, look at me," Kael whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. She stopped, turning to face him in the middle of a small moonlit clearing. He wasn't leaning on her anymore. He was standing on his own, his body straight despite the arrows still protruding from his back. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his tether and had finally found peace with the fall. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away the dried blood on her cheeks with a tenderness that made her heart stop in her chest. Because she was a healer, she knew exactly what that clarity meant. It was the final flare of the candle before the darkness took it. "I am dying, Zara," he said, his golden eyes fixed on hers with a heartbreaking honesty. "The silver rot. It's reached my heart. I won't make it to the boundary." The words struck Zara with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had known it was coming, had seen the signs in the way his skin had turned gray and his scent had soured, but hearing him say it made the reality unavoidable. She reached for her satchel, her fingers frantic as she searched for a cure that she knew didn't exist. "No," she sobbed, the first tears of the night finally breaking through her mask. "No, I didn't save you just to let you die in the dirt. I can fix this. I'm a healer, Kael. I can fix this." "You already fixed it," Kael said, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "You looked at me. You let me see the woman you became. That's more than I deserved." He collapsed into the snow, his strength finally deserting him, his head resting against a gnarled root. He looked up at the moon, which was full and bright, a silent witness to his final moments. He reached out for her hand, and this time, Zara didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, her fingers entwined with his, her tears falling onto his cold, scarred skin. The bond began to fade, the low hum in her mind turning into a long, sustained note of silence. Zara felt the emptiness coming, the total, absolute isolation of the unbonded. She leaned down, her lips brushing his forehead, her hair falling around them like a dark, protective curtain. Because she had once loved him more than her own life, she wanted to be the last thing he saw, the final memory of a man who had finally learned the value of a choice. "I forgive you, Kael," she whispered, the words a lie and a truth all at once. "I forgive you for the altar. I forgive you for the fear." Kael's eyes fluttered, his breathing slowing to a series of long, shallow sighs. He looked at her one last time, his gaze filled with a peace she had never seen in him. "Thank you," he breathed, the words barely a vibration against the air. Then, his eyes went still, the golden light in them going out like a snuffed candle. His hand went limp in hers, the weight of it a sudden, crushing reality. Zara sat in the silence of the clearing, the dead Alpha's head in her lap, the moon shining down on the wreckage of their lives. She felt the bond go silent, the final thread snapping with a quiet, internal sound. She was alone. She was unchosen. She was free. But as she looked at the man who had died to save her, she realized that freedom was a very cold, very lonely thing. She bowed her head, her screams lost to the indifferent mountain, a healer who had finally found a wound she couldn't stitch shut. Is a soul truly free if it has no one left to haunt? The ritual of the end had begun, and Zara was the only one left to witness the dawn. Chapter 19. The Cradle of the Cold. The transition from a shared destiny to an absolute, crushing solitude occurred in the span of a single, silent heartbeat. Zara sat in the center of the moonlit clearing, her legs numbing against the frost-bitten earth as she cradled Kael's heavy, cooling head in her lap. The bond, once a screaming agony and later a low, rhythmic thrum, had vanished, leaving a hollow vacuum in her chest that felt larger than the mountain itself. Because she was a healer, she kept her fingers pressed against the pulse point of his neck long after the heat had fled his skin, waiting for a miracle that her medical mind knew was impossible. The silver rot had claimed its prize, leaving behind a husk of a king and a woman who was no longer sure who she was supposed to be without a ghost to haunt. "You don't get to leave me here," she whispered, her voice a fragile sliver of glass in the vast, indifferent night. She looked down at his face, which appeared younger in death, the lines of constant, predatory stress finally smoothed over by the ultimate finality. He had died a fool's death for a woman who had spent weeks wishing for his downfall, and the irony of it was a bitter bile in her throat. Because she had forgiven him in his final moments, she felt a secondary betrayal, this time from her own heart, which had softened at the exact moment it should have remained stone. She reached out and closed his golden eyes, her touch lingering on his eyelids as she felt the first true wave of grief crash over her, a tidal wave of what-ifs that threatened to pull her under. The woods around her began to stir, the scavengers sensing the shift in the hierarchy as the alpha's scent began to fade into the neutral musk of decay. Zara felt the predatory eyes of the Deadlands fixating on her, a lone female sitting over a mountain of prime meat. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, incandescent rage that she was being expected to mourn and defend at the same time. She reached for Kael's broken sword, the steel freezing her palm, and stood up with a jerky, mechanical grace. If the mountain wanted his body, it would have to go through the woman who had already died once on an altar of his making. "Come on, then," she roared at the shadows, her voice cracking with a manic, jagged energy. "See what's left of the silver moon." A low, vibrating growl answered her from the tree line, but no beast emerged. The scent of her, blood-stained, grieving, and pulsing with a raw, unbonded power, was a deterrent even to the hungriest rogue. She stood guard over him for hours, a solitary sentinel in a silver-white wasteland, until the moon began its slow descent toward the jagged horizon. Because she couldn't leave him to the wolves, she began the grueling task of gathering stones, her fingernails breaking as she pried them from the frozen soil. She was building a cairn, a monument to a man she hated and loved in equal, devastating measure. As the first light of dawn bled across the peaks, the cairn was finished, a jagged gray mound that looked like a natural part of the rugged terrain. Zara stood back, her breath coming in shallow white plumes, her body reaching its absolute breaking point. She looked at the stones and then at the path leading south, toward the boundary of the civilized packs. She realized then that she couldn't go back. She was a creature of the fringe now, a ghost who had buried her past in a pile of rocks. She turned away from the grave, her boots crunching on the crust of the snow, and began the long walk toward a future that had no name. Is a grave a finish line, or just a marker for those left running?
Chapter 20. The Resurrection of the Damned. The darkness was not a void. It was a pressurized, liquid weight that filled his lungs and pressed against the back of his eyes with the force of an ocean. Kael existed in a state of suspended animation, a consciousness trapped in a body that had technically ceased to function. He could feel the silver rot retreating, not because it was cured, but because it had nothing left to consume in a heart that had stopped beating. Because he was a high alpha of the Obsidian Peak, his lineage carried a dormant, ancient resilience, a final spark that the Moon Mother granted to those who died with an unfinished oath. He had promised to protect Zara, and the debt of that promise was a tether that refused to let his soul drift into the light. A sudden, violent jolt of electricity snapped through his nerves, a phantom echo of the bond Zara had tried to jumpstart in the snow. His heart gave a single wet thud, a sound like a heavy door slamming in an empty house. The pain returned instantly, a searing, white-hot agony that made him want to scream, but his lungs were still filled with the cold silence of the grave. He clawed at the darkness, his fingers meeting the rough, unyielding surface of the stones she had piled over him. Because she had buried him, he was now a prisoner of her mercy, a king trapped in a tomb of his own failures. "Move!" he commanded himself, though the word was only a vibration in his mind. He pushed against the rocks, his muscles screaming as the blood began to circulate again, thick and sluggish as cold honey. One stone shifted, then another, a sliver of gray morning light piercing the darkness of the cairn. He gasped, a ragged, agonizing sound as his lungs finally cleared the stagnant air, and he hauled himself from the earth like a corpse rising for judgment. He collapsed onto the snow, his skin the color of ash, his golden eyes blown wide and glassy as they took in the empty clearing. Zara was gone. She had done her duty as a healer and a mate, and she had moved on to a life that didn't include a dead man. He looked at his hands, which were stained with the dirt of his own grave, and felt a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He could go back to the peak now. He could reclaim his throne and tell his people that he had survived the impossible. But the thought of the crown felt like a lead weight, a shackle he no longer had the strength to carry. Because he had died, the alpha he used to be was truly gone. The man standing in the snow was a blank slate, a rogue with a heart that only beat for a woman who was miles away and probably wishing he was still under the rocks. "I'm coming for you," he whispered, his voice a broken shard of glass. He didn't mean it as a threat or a claim. He meant it as a pilgrimage. He began to walk, his steps uneven and heavy, following the faint, fading scent of mint and lavender that still clung to the frozen air. He was a ghost trailing a goddess, a predator who had finally learned that the greatest hunt was the search for forgiveness. Because he had nothing left to lose, not his pack, not his pride, not even his life, he was the most dangerous version of himself yet. He didn't care about the rogues in the shadows or the freezing wind. He only cared about the trajectory of the sun and the direction of her footprints. He reached the edge of the clearing where the rogue wolf's carcass lay, already being picked over by crows. He saw the marks of Zara's struggle, the way she had stood her ground and fought with a lethal, desperate grace. A surge of pride, sharp and painful, flared in his chest. She didn't need him. She had never needed him. That was the truth he had been too afraid to see at the altar. Because she was strong enough to survive without him, his presence in her life was a choice, not a necessity. And he would spend the rest of his borrowed time trying to make her choose him again. Does a man who rises from the dead deserve a second chance? Or is he just a ghost refusing to leave the party?
Chapter 21. The city of the unclaimed. The rogue boundary was marked by a river of black, churning water that never froze, its surface reflecting the bruised, turbulent sky of the lower territories. Zara stood on the northern bank, her breath hitching as she looked across the bridge made of rusted iron and ancient petrified wood. On the other side lay Oakhaven, not a pack settlement, but a sprawling, chaotic neutral zone where the unclaimed went to lose themselves. It was a city of outcasts, healers, and failed warriors, a place where the Moon Mother's laws were replaced by the harsh, pragmatic rules of the trade. Because she had no home and no mate, she was the perfect citizen for a city of ghosts. Name and business, a guard growled at the gate, his eyes tracking the dried blood on her cloak with a clinical indifference. Zara. Healer, she replied, her voice sounding like stone grinding against stone. The guard grunted and stepped aside, the heavy iron gates groaning as they swung open. Zara stepped into Oakhaven, and the sensory overload hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, cheap ale, and the underlying musk of 1,000 different shifters living in cramped proximity. There was no pack harmony here, only the constant, vibrating tension of a crowd. Because she was a healer, she saw the wounds before she saw the people, the limps, the scars, the haunted looks of those who had been rejected or forgotten. She felt a strange, grim sense of belonging. She was just another piece of wreckage in a harbor of broken ships. She found a room in a boarding house that smelled of damp wool and old grease, the floorboards creaking under her boots as she collapsed onto the thin, straw-filled mattress. She didn't undress. She didn't even wash the blood from her face. She simply stared at the ceiling, watching the flickering shadows of the street lamps dance across the cracked plaster. The silence in her head was absolute, a void where the bond used to be, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. Because she had spent her life wanting to be heard, the total absence of connection was a weight she didn't know how to carry. "You can't hide here forever, dearie," a voice said from the hallway. Zara sat up, her hand instantly going to her belt. An older woman, her hair a wild mane of silver, and her eyes sharp as a hawk's, was leaning against the doorframe. She held a tray with a bowl of thin broth and a piece of crusty bread. "The city doesn't like secrets. They fester, and you smell like a high alpha's funeral." Zara didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't want a mentor or a friend. She wanted to be invisible. But in Oakhaven, invisibility was a luxury that had to be earned. "I'm just looking for work," Zara said, her voice a low, tired rasp. The woman laughed, a sound like dry parchment crinkling. "A healer with your scent? You'll have more work than you can handle by sundown. The rogues are always breaking things they can't fix." She set the tray on the small, rickety table and turned to leave. "Get some sleep, Zara. The shadows in this town have teeth, and they like to chew on the ones who are still mourning." Zara watched her leave, the word mourning echoing in the empty room. She wasn't mourning a man. She was mourning the woman she used to be, the one who thought love was a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. As she drifted into a fitful, dreamless sleep, a sudden sharp vibration hummed through the floorboards. It wasn't the city's traffic or the wind. It was a familiar, rhythmic thud that matched the heartbeat she had buried in the mountains. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. She had felt the bond snap. She had piled the stones with her own hands. Because she was a woman of science, she told herself it was just a phantom sensation, a trick of a traumatized mind. "He's dead," she whispered to the darkness, the words a mantra of survival. But the vibration didn't stop. It grew stronger, a low-frequency call that resonated in her very marrow. Somewhere out there in the dark, beyond the walls of Oakhaven and the frozen river, a ghost was walking. And it was coming for her. Is the return of the dead a blessing or the ultimate haunting? The dawn was coming, and with it, the realization that some bonds are deeper than the grave. Chapter 22. The Lazarus sent Oak Haven at dawn was a city of gray smoke and iron-colored mist, a place where the morning didn't break so much as it bled into existence. Zara stood by the window of her boarding house, her fingers tracing the frost patterns on the glass. She had spent the night in a state of hypervigilance, her healer's ears straining for a sound that shouldn't exist. The vibration in the floorboards had faded into the general thrum of the city, but the phantom weight in her chest remained. Because she had lived her life by the laws of biology, the idea of a resurrection felt like a personal insult, a disruption of the natural order she had fought so hard to maintain. "You're twitchy, girl," the silver-haired landlady, Martha, noted as she shoved a mop across the landing. "Like a doe that smells the wolf but can't see the fur." Zara didn't turn around. She was watching a figure move through the crowded market square below. It wasn't him. It was a hunched old man selling charred meats, but every shadow seemed to take Kael's shape. She felt a sudden, violent urge to run, to put another mountain range between herself and the cairn she had built. But where did a woman go when she was already at the edge of the world? She reached for her cloak, the heavy wool still smelling faintly of Kael's blood and the cold ozone of the high peaks. She needed to lose herself in the work. She needed the distraction of other people's pain. She spent the morning in the gutter clinic, a lean-to near the Black River where the poorest rogues came to have their infections drained. She worked with a clinical, detached efficiency, her hands steady as she stitched a jagged claw wound on a young boy's shoulder. Because she was a high healer, her presence was a miracle to these people, but she felt like a fraud. She was mending flesh while her own spirit was a patchwork of scars and silence. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gold fading from Kael's gaze, and the guilt of her relief, the relief that it was finally over, stung like salt in an open cut. By midday, the air in the clinic grew heavy, the scent of antiseptic herbs failing to mask a sudden, sharp intrusion. It was a smell of mountain pine, crushed lavender, and something deeper, the metallic, earthy tang of a grave. Zara's needle faltered, the tip piercing her own thumb. She didn't cry out. She simply stared at the bead of blood welling on her skin, her heart stopping in her chest. Because she had spent years tracking the scents of the forest, she knew this wasn't a memory. It was a presence. "Healer?" the boy on the table asked, his eyes wide with concern. "Stay still," Zara whispered, her voice a hollow reed. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She walked to the entrance of the clinic, the heavy canvas flap fluttering in the cold breeze. Standing across the muddy street, leaning against a rusted lamppost, was a ghost. He was wrapped in a tattered, dark cloak, his face gaunted and pale as the moon, but his eyes, those terrifying, beautiful golden eyes, were fixed on her with a desperate, singular focus. Kael was standing in the center of the city of outcasts, a man who had crawled out of the earth to find the woman he had lost. Is a miracle just a tragedy that refused to stay buried?
Chapter 23. The King of Ash Kael watched her emerge from the clinic, and for a moment, the agony of his healing body simply vanished. She looked like a goddess of the slums, her dark hair tangled and her face smudged with the soot of the city. But to him, she was the only light in a world that had gone dark. He stayed back, his hands buried in the folds of his cloak to hide the way they were shaking. Because he had risen from the dead, he felt like a monster, a creature that shouldn't exist, and he didn't want to see the horror in her eyes when she realized the stones hadn't held him. "Zara," he breathed, the name a jagged prayer that barely carried across the street. He saw her flinch, her body tensing as if she were preparing for a blow. She didn't run toward him and she didn't scream. She simply stood there, her hands clenched at her sides, watching him with a look of such profound, exhausted disbelief that it broke the heart he had just reclaimed. He took a tentative step forward, his boots sinking into the black mud. He felt the eyes of the city on him, the predators sensing his power, the scavengers sensing his weakness. He didn't care. He was a man who had crossed the border of life and death, and he wasn't going to let a few rogues stop him now. "I'm not a ghost, Zara," he said, his voice gaining a raw, vibrating strength. The Moon Mother. She wasn't done with me. Or maybe I just wasn't done with you. He saw the anger flare in her eyes then, a bright forest green fire that made him feel alive for the first time in years. She marched across the street, her boots splashing in the puddles, and stopped inches from his chest. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his cloak, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. He expected her to hit him, or perhaps to weep, but instead, she leaned in until their foreheads touched, her breath hot against his cold skin. "You arrogant, selfish fool," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and relief. "I buried you. I said the words. I carried the weight of your death for miles, and you just walk into my city like it's a social call?" She shoved him back, her hands shaking. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to die and come back whenever it's convenient for your redemption." "It wasn't convenient, Zara," Kael replied, his golden eyes searching hers. "It was hell. But I promised I wouldn't leave you alone in the dark. I intend to keep that promise, even if you never let me touch you again. I'm not the High Alpha anymore. I'm just a man who followed his heart to the end of the world. Because he had lost everything, his crown, his pride, even his mortality, he had finally found the one thing that mattered. He wasn't there to reclaim her. He was there to serve her." He saw her resolve crumble, the hard mask of the healer finally shattering to reveal the woman who had been mourning him in secret. She didn't fall into his arms. She simply slumped against the lamppost, her head in her hands. "What are we supposed to do, Kael?" she whispered. "The peak is gone. The silver moon is a memory. We are two ghosts in a city of rogues." Kael stepped closer, his hand hesitating before resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't feel the bond flare with the old, possessive intensity. Instead, he felt a slow, steady warmth, a choice being made in the silence. "We do what you do best, Zara," he said, his voice a low, soothing silk. "We heal. We start here. We build something that isn't based on bloodlines or thrones, but on the fact that we're both still breathing. Is a life built on wreckage stronger than one built on stone?"
Chapter 24. The New Dawn. The sun finally broke through the mist of Oakhaven, casting long golden fingers across the Black River. Zara looked up at Kael, seeing the man he had become, the King of Ash, the ghost who refused to haunt. She felt the silence in her head, the absence of the old forced bond, and realized that she liked it. She didn't want a fated mate who was tied to her by cosmic strings. She wanted a partner who chose to stand beside her when the world was falling apart. Because she was a woman who had survived the Deadlands, she knew that the only real power was the power to stay. "If you stay here," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you're just another rogue. No furs, no throne, just a man who helps me carry the herbs." Kael smiled, and for the first time, the gold in his eyes looked like sunlight instead of fire. "That sounds like a promotion," he replied. They walked back toward the clinic together, not as a mated pair, but as two survivors navigating the mud of a new life. The city of the unclaimed watched them pass, a healer with blood on her hands, and a dead king with a heart that beat for no one but her. They weren't perfect, and they weren't healed, but they were whole. Because they had survived the rejection, the mountain, and the grave, they knew that nothing could break them now. Zara stopped at the door of the clinic, looking out at the horizon where the silver moon used to rise. She felt a phantom sensation of a wolf running in the distance. Not her wolf, but a memory of the spirit that had guided her. She didn't need it anymore. She had her own voice now, and it was loud enough to shake the mountains. She turned to Kael, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Welcome to Oakhaven, Kael," she said. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold wind of the peaks. In the quiet of the clinic, surrounded by the smell of sage and the promise of a long, difficult, beautiful future, the healer and her ghost began the work of living. Does every ending have to be a tragedy, or can it be a quiet, hard-won peace? The story of the rejected mate was over. The story of Zara and Kael had just begun.